Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the incredible workings of your renal system.
That's right.
We've gathered some really fascinating material to unpack the anatomy and physiology of these, well, absolutely crucial organs.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission, it's really to understand exactly how the system manages to, create urine and maybe even more importantly, how it just tirelessly maintains that delicate balance inside your body.
Exactly. It's a system that, well, it often just hums away unnoticed, doesn't it? But it's performing this constant vital service.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the key components. You've got the kidneys, those amazing filters,
Mm-hmm.
the ureters, which are like the transport pipes, the bladder, our efficient little storage tank, and then finally the urethra, the exit path.
Okay.
Think of it like an incredibly well-engineered internal processing plant, really.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with the stars of the show.
Yeah.
Kidneys themselves. Where exactly are these located?
So the kidneys sit on either side of your spine, quite high up actually, near the 11th and 12th ribs, basically just above your waist.
Okay.
And interestingly, the inner kind of concave surface of each kidney faces inwards, towards your backbone.
That gives you a good picture. Now, for organs that, we don't often think about directly, they get a surprising amount of blood, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. It's quite remarkable. Despite making up only about, 0.4% of your total body weight,
Yeah.
maybe 120 to 170 grams each,
Tiny.
they receive a massive 20 to 25% of your heart's entire cardiac output.
Wow. 20 to 25%.
Yeah. This huge blood flow just highlights the kidney's relentless job filtering your entire blood volume multiple times an hour. It's just this nonstop detoxification and balancing act.
That really drives home their importance. So what's going on inside these powerhouses? You hear about the cortex and medulla.
Right. Think of the kidney's internal structure as being organized into two main zones. There's an outer layer called the cortex and then an inner region, the medulla. And these aren't just random sections. They represent this highly organized arrangement of microscopic tubes. These tubes are the fundamental working parts.
Gotcha.
And speaking of the working parts, the functional units, we absolutely have to talk about the nephron.
Okay, that's where the real magic happens. Is that right? Tell us about that.
Precisely. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidney. It's where all the critical processes, filtration, reabsorption, secretion, it all happens there.
Okay.
Think of each nephron as a tiny, super sophisticated filtration and reabsorption machine, like the ultimate control center for keeping your blood composition just right.
Millions of tiny control centers.
Exactly. And these nephrons are located in that outer cortex, but they also dip down into the inner medulla. And what's really interesting is the unique way blood actually flows through each nephron.
Unique, we're still talking arteries and veins, yeah.
Yes, but the setup is quite specialized. The kidneys have something called a renal portal system.
A portal system, okay.
Yeah. So blood flows from the renal arteries into smaller vessels, the afferent arterioles.
Afferent, meaning going towards.
Right. Then they lead to the first capillary network, this little ball of capillaries called the glomerulus.
The filter.
That's a primary filter.
Yeah.
Now here's the twist. Instead of going straight into a venule, a small vein, the blood flows out of the glomerulus through efferent arterioles.
Efferent, so away from.
Correct. And these then lead to a second capillary network. These are the peritubular capillaries and the vasorecta, and they wrap really closely around all the kidney's processing tubules.
Ah, okay.
Only after this second network does the blood finally collect into venules and then into larger veins.
So it's like a double pass through capillaries. First the big filter, then capillaries for reabsorption.
Exactly. The double capillary setup lets you have the initial high-pressure filtration in the glomerulus, and then this second low-pressure network right next to the tubules, perfect for finally tuning what gets reabsorbed back into the blood or secreted into the urine.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. A double capillary system. Got it. So once the urine is actually formed in these nephrons, how does it get out of the kidney itself?
Right, so the newly formed urine collects in this sort of funnel-shaped area inside the kidney called the renal pelvis.
Okay.
From the renal pelvis, it then travels down the ureters, these are muscular tubes, remember,
Right.
down towards the bladder. And this journey isn't just gravity, it's actively helped along by these rhythmic contractions of the smooth muscle in the ureter walls, kind of gently pushing the urine along.
Like peristalsis, but for urine.
Pretty much, yeah. A wave-like motion.
And the bladder, that's our temporary holding tank until we find a suitable moment, right?
Exactly it. The bladder is a hollow organ, and its walls have these really well-developed layers of smooth muscle. This muscular nature lets it stretch and store urine, quite a bit actually, until the signal comes to empty it.
So we followed the urine from creation in the nephron, collection in the renal pelvis, transport down the ureters to storage in the bladder. Let's trace that final bit of the journey. What happens next?
Right, so that whole process, filtering plasma, modifying the fluid in the tubules, transport via ureters, storage in the bladder, it all culminates in expulsion from the body through the urethra.
Okay.
And actually, it's worth pointing out a key anatomical difference between males and females right here with the urethra.
Ah, yes, the urethra. How does it differ?
Well, the female urethra is significantly shorter than the male urethra.
Right.
And this anatomical difference, unfortunately, means that bacteria have a much shorter distance to travel to reach the bladder in females. That's a primary reason why urinary tract infections, or UTIs, are considerably more common in women.
That makes perfect sense just from a plumbing perspective, really. Okay, so let's focus on that final stage, storage and release. The bladder. We know it can hold, you said, a fair amount, maybe 500 milliliters or so.
Yeah, around that much, comfortably for most adults.
So what stops it from just constantly leaking out?
Ah, good question. That's where the bladder neck and the sphincters come in. The bladder neck is the area where the bladder joins the urethra.
Okay.
And the opening between them is controlled by two muscular rings, the sphincters. You've got the internal sphincter, which is smooth muscle, so it's involuntary and it's normally contracted, just automatically keeping the path closed.
Like an automatic gate.
Exactly. Then just below that, you have the external sphincter. This one's skeletal muscle.
Ah, some voluntary control.
That's right. It's under our conscious control via somatic motor neurons, but is also kept sort of tonically contracted, just held tense by signals from the central nervous system, even when we're not actively thinking about it. So it's like a double lock.
A two-stage locking mechanism. One automatic, one manual override. Okay. Now, how does the actual urge, the feeling that you need to go, get triggered?
This involves a really interesting spinal reflex called micturition, or, urination.
Micturition.
Yeah.
Got it.
As the bladder fills up with urine, its walls stretch.
Mm-hmm.
And there are specialized sensory receptors, stretch receptors, embedded in the bladder wall.
Okay.
When they get stretched enough, they fire off signals via sensory neurons that travel up to the spinal cord.
Right.
In the spinal cord, this information gets processed, integrated, and it does two key things almost simultaneously. First, it stimulates parasympathetic neurons.
Parasympathetic. Rest and digest.
Exactly. Those parasympathetic neurons go back to the bladder and cause its smooth muscle wall, the detrusor muscle, to contract, to squeeze.
Okay, so the bladder starts squeezing. What's the second thing?
The second thing is that the same spinal reflex inhibits the motor neurons that are keeping that external urethral sphincter tense.
Ah, so it tells the voluntary muscle to relax.
Precisely. So you get this coordinated action. The bladder muscle squeezes down, and the external gate, the sphincter, relaxes and opens up.
Wow. Squeeze and release. That sounds incredibly efficient.
It is. This coordinated contraction and relaxation pushes the urine out through the urethra. But, and this is crucial, while it's a basic spinal reflex, higher centers in your brain, like the pons and the cerebral cortex, can exert voluntary control over it.
Yeah.
This is how we learn, to hold it and decide when and where it's appropriate to urinate.
Right. That explains potty training. So before we develop that conscious higher brain control, it's purely this reflex driving things.
Exactly. In very young children, before they fully develop that voluntary sphincter control, this simple micturition reflex is pretty much the primary way the bladder empties itself. It fills, stretches, signals, contracts, empties. Repeat.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about one of the renal system's most vital roles, maintaining homeostasis, especially that balance of water and electrolytes in our bodies. Let's start with water balance. We hear constantly stay hydrated, but what's the fundamental science there?
Well, water is, as you know, the most abundant molecule in the body. In women, say age 17 to 39, it makes up roughly 50% of total body weight.
Half.
Wow. Yeah, so maybe around 30 liters in a 60-kilogram woman. In men, in that same age range, it's a bit higher, closer to 60%, so maybe 42 liters in a 70-kilogram man.
Okay.
And the core principle for keeping this vital balance is actually pretty straightforward. What goes in must come out. Inputs have to equal outputs over time.
Inputs equal outputs. Makes sense. So where does this water typically come from and where does it go on an average day?
Okay, so on average, daily water intake is about 2.5 liters. Most of that, maybe 2.2 liters, comes from the food we eat and the fluids we drink.
Right.
The other 0.3 liters or so is actually generated internally as a byproduct of our metabolic processes.
Metabolic water.
Okay, exactly. Then on the output side, we typically lose about 1.5 liters in urine. That's the kidney's main job in regulating volume. We also lose around zero point 0.9 liters through what's called insensible loss.
Insensible, meaning we don't notice it.
Right. That's water loss through just breathing it out, and evaporation from the skin that you're not aware of, unlike sweat. And then a small amount, maybe 0.1 liters, is lost in feces. So roughly 2.5 liters in, 2.5 liters out.
It's a constant balancing act then. Now, how does the body actually regulate the water inside our individual cells? I remember hearing about osmosis.
Yes, absolutely. The concentration of solutes, things like salts and sugars in the fluid outside our cells, the extracellular fluid or LEC, is critical. We call this concentration the LEC osmolality.
Osmolality, like the saltiness?
Kind of, yeah. It's the concentration of all dissolved particles. And water, well, water always moves across cell membranes from an area where the solute concentration is lower to an area where it's higher. That's osmosis.
Trying to dilute the more concentrated side.
Precisely. So if your LEC osmolality goes down, maybe you drank way too much plain water, the fluid outside your cells becomes less concentrated than the fluid inside. So water moves into your cells, causing them to swell up.
Which sounds bad.
It can be, yeah. Conversely, if your LEC osmolality goes up maybe after a really salty meal, or if you're dehydrated, the fluid outside becomes more concentrated, so water moves out of your cells, causing them to shrink.
That also sounds bad, especially for brain cells, I imagine.
Absolutely. Brain cells are particularly sensitive to changes in volume. And maintaining this delicate osmotic equilibrium involves, well, a coordinated effort from several systems. Your respiratory system plays a role, your circulatory system, behavioral responses like feeling thirsty, and of course, crucial renal responses orchestrated by the kidneys.
Okay, let's dive into those renal responses then. Hormones are key here, I gather. Tell us about vasopressin, or ADH.
Right. Vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, is a small protein, just a 9-amino acid peptide. But it's absolutely central to controlling how much water your kidneys excrete.
Antidiuretic, so it stops urination. Or reduces it.
It reduces water excretion, exactly. It signals to specific parts of the kidney tubules and collecting ducts to become more permeable to water, allowing more water to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream instead of being lost in urine.
So more ADH means less urine, and it's more concentrated urine.
You got it. Less ADH means more dilute urine and more water loss.
And what triggers the release of this ADH?
Several things. The main ones are increased osmolality of the blood, so if your blood gets too concentrated,
Right.
and decreased blood volume or blood pressure. Both signal the need to conserve water. Also, interestingly, in adults, there's a daily pattern, a circadian rhythm to its secretion. Levels typically increase during the night.
Ah, so that's why we usually don't have to get up to pee multiple times overnight.
That's a big part of it, yes. That nighttime surge in vasopressin leads to less urine production, and it's more concentrated, helping us conserve water and sleep undisturbed.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned before maybe a link to bedwetting in kids.
Yes, it's been suggested that nocturnal enuresis, or bedwetting, in some children, might be linked to a delay in the maturation of this normal nighttime increase in vasopressin. They might not be concentrating their urine effectively overnight yet.
Interesting. Okay, another key hormonal player I remember reading about is the renin-angiotensin system. That sounds complicated. Can you break it down?
It is a multi-step pathway, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's absolutely critical for regulating blood pressure and also sodium balance. It starts in the kidneys.
Okay.
There are specialized cells there, right near the glomerulus, called juxtaglomerular granular cells. Think of them as sensors.
Sensing what?
They sense a few things, mainly a drop in blood pressure in the afferent arteriole feeding the glomerulus, or low sodium levels detected in the fluid passing through a nearby part of the tubule.
Okay, low pressure or low salt triggers them.
Right. When triggered, these cells release an enzyme called renin into the bloodstream.
Renin, okay.
Now, renin itself doesn't do much directly. Its job is to find a protein that's always circulating in your blood, made by the liver, called angiotensinogen.
Angiotensinogen sounds like a precursor.
Exactly. Renin acts like molecular scissors and clips off a piece of angiotensinogen, converting it into angiotensin-defier, or Angi-1.
Okay, step one, renin makes Angi.
Correct. But Angi is still not very active. It needs another conversion. As blood-containing Angi circulates, particularly as it passes through the lungs.
The lungs, why there?
The lungs have a very high concentration of another enzyme embedded in the capillary walls called angiotensin-converting enzyme. or ACE.
ACE, like AC inhibitors for blood pressure?
Precisely. ACE's job is to convert Ang into the highly active form, angiotensin II or Ang2.
Okay, so renin makes angio, ACE makes Ang2. What does Ang2 do?
Ang is the real workhorse. It does several things. It's a powerful vasoconstrictor, meaning it narrows blood vessels, which directly increases blood pressure. It also stimulates thirst, making you want to drink more water. And importantly for our discussion, it stimulates the adrenal cortex glands sitting on top of the kidneys to release another hormone called aldosterone.
Aldosterone. Okay, another hormone. What's its role here?
Aldosterone primarily acts on the kidneys to increase the reabsorption of sodium, and because water tends to follow salt.
It helps retain water too, raising blood volume and pressure.
Exactly. Aldosterone also plays a really critical role in regulating potassium levels, which is probably a good place to transition to talking about electrolytes specifically.
Perfect timing. Let's talk potassium K plus chat. We hear about bananas and potassium. Why is it so vital, and how do the kidneys keep its levels in that tight range?
Potassium is absolutely crucial. Its concentration directly affects the electrical potential across cell membranes, which is fundamental for nerve impulse transmission and muscle contraction, especially critically the heart muscle.
Right.
The normal range for potassium in blood plasma is really narrow, only about 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter, or MEQL.
Very narrow.
Extremely. And maintaining this precise range is essential. Ideally, your daily potassium intake from food should roughly match what your body excretes, mainly via the kidneys.
So the kidneys are the main regulators. How do they adjust excretion?
Aldosterone is the key player here too. Remember, Ang2 stimulates aldosterone. Well, high potassium levels in the blood also directly stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone.
So aldosterone responds to both low sodium pressure and high potassium.
Correct. And what does aldosterone do regarding potassium? It acts on the kidneys to increase the secretion or excretion of potassium into the urine.
So eat more potassium, more aldosterone, pee out more potassium, a feedback loop.
Exactly. It's a crucial mechanism to prevent potassium levels from getting too high, because imbalances, either too low or too high, can have really significant, even life-threatening consequences.
Okay, let's unpack those imbalances. What happens if levels go too low? Hypokalemia.
Right, hypokalemia. That's technically plasma potassium below 3.5 milli-UQL, but you often don't see major effects until it drops below 3.0.
What kind of effects?
It can cause muscle weakness, fatigue, cramps, constipation, because muscle and nerve function is impaired. In more severe cases, it can lead to failure of muscles, including the heart and respiratory muscles. You can also get paresthesias, those tingling or prickling sensations, and dangerous heart rhythm problems, arrhythmias.
Why does low potassium cause weakness?
Basically, low potassium outside the cell makes the cell membrane hyperpolarized, meaning it's harder to reach the threshold needed to fire an action potential, an electrical signal. So nerves and muscles become less excitable.
Harder to wake up. Okay. Does it show up on an ECG?
Yes. Characteristic ECG changes include flattened T waves, the appearance of U wave, and ST segment depression.
What usually causes hypokalemia?
Common causes include using certain diuretics, water pills that make you lose potassium, excessive vomiting or diarrhea, which causes loss of fluids rich in potassium, and also conditions like hyperaldosteronism, where you have too much aldosterone constantly telling the kidneys to dump potassium.
And the heart risks are serious.
Very. Ventricular tachycardia, atrial fibrillation, these can be life-threatening arrhythmias triggered by low potassium. Treatment usually involves carefully replacing potassium, often orally, with supplements and potassium-rich foods.
Okay, that sounds serious enough. What about the other side, hyperkalemia, too much potassium?
Hyperkalemia, usually defined as plasma potassium above, say, a 5.5 or 6.0 every EQL, can actually be even more immediately dangerous than hypokalemia.
Really? Why is that?
Initially, the higher potassium outside the cell makes the cell membrane partially depolarized, meaning it's closer to the firing threshold, so cells can become more excitable initially. You might see muscle twitching.
Okay.
But, and this is the critical part, if the potassium stays high, the cell membrane can't properly repolarize. It can't reset after firing. So it ends up in a state where it becomes less excitable or unable to fire properly at all.
So paradoxically, too much potassium also leads to weakness.
Exactly. It can lead to muscle weakness, progressing to paralysis, paresthesias again, and critically dangerous cardiac arrhythmias.
What does hyperkalemia look like on an ECG?
The classic signs are peaked, tall T waves, a widening of the QRS complex, which represents a ventricular contraction, and eventually ST segment depression. As it gets worse, the rhythm can deteriorate into ventricular fibrillation or even a systole, a flatline.
That's extremely dangerous. What causes hyperkalemia?
Kidney failure, or renal insufficiency, is a major cause because the kidneys can't excrete potassium effectively. Certain medications are common culprits too, things like ACE inhibitors and ARBs, which interfere with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and potassium-sparing diuretics like spironolactone. Also, metabolic acidosis, where the blood is too acidic, can cause potassium to shift out of cells into the plasma. And extensive injuries, like crush injuries or severe burns, can release large amounts of potassium from damaged cells.
So multiple potential causes. How is it treated in an emergency?
Treatment focuses on protecting the heart immediately, usually with intravenous calcium gluconate, which helps stabilize the cardiac cell membrane potential even if potassium is high. Then steps are taken to shift potassium back into cells, often using insulin, along with glucose, and measures to increase potassium excretion from the body, like using certain diuretics or sometimes dialysis if kidney function is poor.
It really underscores how vital that narrow 3.55 range is. Are there other common things that can throw potassium off?
Yes, definitely. We mentioned some medications like NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, which can sometimes impair kidney function. Diuretics, as we said, are a big one for causing loss. Metabolic acidosis, pushing K+ out. Even things like prolonged fasting can sometimes disrupt the balance. It's all interconnected.
Incredibly complex system keeping everything just right. Okay, let's shift back slightly to intake signals, thirst and our craving for salt. How does the renal system or related systems manage those?
Right, so the body needs ways to signal when it needs more water or salt. For thirst, we have specialized sensors primarily in the hypothalamus region of the brain. They're called osmoreceptors.
Sensing osmolality again.
Exactly. When the osmolality of the fluid around them increases, meaning the blood is getting too concentrated, usually above about 280 million millis per liter, these osmoreceptors are stimulated, and that triggers the conscious sensation of thirst, driving you to drink.
Makes sense. Drink water, dilute the blood.
Precisely. And interestingly, the very act of drinking, even before the water is fully absorbed into your system, can start to relieve thirst.
Really? How?
It seems we have receptors in our mouth and throat or pharyngeal receptors that respond to the presence and maybe the coolness of water, sending signals that say, okay, relief is on the way. This can decrease thirst and also reduce vasopressin release temporarily.
Ah. Is that why ice chips are sometimes given to patients, like after surgery when they can't drink much?
That's thought to be part of the reason, yes. It provides some of that oral sensation that can temporarily alleviate thirst without giving a large volume of fluid.
Clever. And what about salt? Do we have salt receptors?
We don't have osmoreceptors for salt specifically in the same way, but low sodium levels, often linked to low blood volume via that renin-angiotensin system, can trigger a specific behavioral drive known as salt appetite, a craving for salty foods to help replenish sodium.
The body telling you what it needs. Okay, so what happens in a really extreme situation, like severe dehydration? How does the body scramble to cope?
In severe dehydration, multiple systems kick into high gear. First, the body tries desperately to conserve fluid. Vasopressin levels will be maxed out to minimize urine loss.
Okay.
Cardiovascular reflexes will be triggered to try and maintain blood pressure. Despite the low volume heart rate increases, blood vessels constrict, and of course, thirst will be intense.
Makes sense. What about aldosterone in that situation? Because low volume stimulates it, but high osmolality might inhibit it.
That's a great point. The adrenal cortex gets conflicting signals. Decreased blood volume pressure strongly stimulates aldosterone release via ANGDU. But very high LEC osmolality, which usually accompanies severe dehydration, tends to inhibit aldosterone secretion.
So which signal wins?
Generally, the high osmolality signal, the need to prevent cells from shrinking further, tends to override. Conserving water by responding to vasopressin becomes the absolute top priority, even if it means not retaining as much sodium via aldosterone as the low volume might otherwise dictate. The cellular dehydration is seen as the more immediate threat.
Prioritizing cell volume. And what are the effects if that dehydration gets really bad, especially on the brain? You mentioned cell shrinkage earlier.
Right. As neurons lose water and shrink in a hyperosmotic environment, their function is impaired. They become less excitable. This translates clinically to CNS depression, confusion, lethargy, disorientation. If it progresses, it can lead to coma. And if the respiratory centers in the brainstem are sufficiently depressed,
Respiratory failure.
yes, potentially leading to respiratory arrest and death. It's a stark reminder of how absolutely fundamental water balance is for basic cell function, particularly nerve cells.
A very sobering thought. And just briefly, you mentioned acid-base balance earlier. How does that contrast? if dehydration causes CNS depression, what does the opposite, like alkalosis, do?
Right, just as a contrast. In alkalosis, where the body's pH is too high, neurons actually become hyperexcitable. They fire too easily.
Too easily?
Yeah. This can initially cause sensory symptoms like numbness or tingling, pins and needles. Then it can progress to muscle twitching, spasms, even seizures in severe cases. And if the muscles involved in breathing become tetanic, spasming uncontrollably.
It can paralyze breathing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Severe alkalosis can also impair breathing by causing paralysis of respiratory muscles. So whether it's water balance, electrolytes, or pH, the body needs to stay within these incredibly narrow windows for everything to work properly.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the renal system, just incredible complexity. To wrap things up, what are the key takeaways you'd really want our listeners to hold on to from this?
I think the main things are, first, just appreciating the intricate anatomy, especially the nephron, with that unique double capillary system allowing for both powerful filtration and fine-tuned reabsorption.
Yeah, the portal system was eye-opening.
And second, understanding that the kidneys do so much more than just make urine. They are absolutely vital regulators of your body's internal environment, controlling water balance, ensuring electrolytes like sodium and potassium stay within that razor-thin, safe range,
Right.
and contributing to blood pressure control and even acid-base balance. We saw how hormones like vasopressin, aldosterone, and the whole renin-angiotensin system orchestrate this complex dance to maintain homeostasis.
Absolutely. It's just remarkable how sensitive these processes are, how interconnected everything is.
It really is. And that, I suppose, leads to our final thought for you, the listener. Take a moment to consider how seemingly small things, maybe not drinking quite enough water on a hot day, or eating a very high-salt meal, or even starting a new medication like a diuretic or an ACE inhibitor, can ripple through this incredibly delicate system.
Yeah.
It really makes you appreciate the body's constant, remarkable, and usually silent effort to keep everything in perfect equilibrium, doesn't it?